3 newborn cries, 3 tiny lives, and one mother who should have been surrounded by warmth, celebration, and love, but instead found herself staring at an envelope she never expected to see in a hospital room. Amara Nwosu had barely caught her breath after giving birth to triplets when the door to her recovery suite opened. She thought it would be a nurse, maybe the pediatric doctor, maybe even someone from her family. But it was her husband, and he was not alone. He entered in a tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and the kind of expression that told everyone in the room he had not come to admire his children. Behind him stood a woman from his business world, elegant, silent, and far too comfortable for someone standing inside another woman's maternity room. Then, without greeting Amara, without stepping closer to the bassinets, without even asking how the babies were doing, he placed a thick envelope on her bed. "Read it when you feel strong enough," he said calmly. Amara looked down. Her hands were still trembling from labor. Her heart was still trying to settle from the storm of the last several hours. The babies had only just been cleaned, wrapped, and placed in the nursery bassinets beside her. And yet, in that very moment, the one man who should have stood beside her had chosen this hour, this room, this sacred beginning, to end everything. Inside the envelope were separation papers. Not a conversation, not an explanation, not even an apology. Just signatures waiting for her name. Amara lifted her eyes to her husband's face, as if she could still find some trace of the man she had once trusted. But his face had already changed into that distant, polished expression people wear when they have convinced themselves that cruelty is simply efficiency. "You're doing this now?" she whispered. He adjusted his cuff and glanced briefly toward the bassinets, though not long enough to truly see the children. "It's better not to delay the inevitable," he replied. "We both know this marriage has not been working." The room fell silent. One nurse froze near the monitor. Another lowered her clipboard and looked away, as if she knew this was not a moment anyone should have to witness. Amara swallowed hard. Her voice was weak, but steady enough to ask the question that mattered most. "And our children?" His answer came far too fast. "They'll be provided for." Provided for. As if they were line items. As if life could be reduced to a payment schedule. Then he stepped back. The woman behind him shifted her handbag on her shoulder and avoided Amara's eyes. And just like that, the man Amara had once built her future around turned away from her hospital bed and walked out of the room, leaving behind silence, leaving behind papers, leaving behind a mother who had just brought 3 children into the world. But what he did not know, what he could not have imagined, was that before the sun rose the next morning, the balance of power in that marriage would change forever. Because while he was walking away from Amara Nwosu was walking, without even knowing it yet, straight into an inheritance that would place an entire financial empire in her hands. And the very institution that kept his business breathing was about to answer to her. Before we continue, take a second and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love powerful stories of quiet strength and unexpected turnarounds, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Now let's get into the story. Amara spent the next hour in a strange stillness. Not because she felt nothing, but because some forms of pain are too large to arrive all at once. The triplets were moved briefly for routine observation. They were healthy, the doctors said. Small, yes, but strong. That single sentence became the thread Amara held on to while everything else seemed to slip out of place. Healthy. Strong. She repeated those words in her mind as if they were a prayer. A senior nurse named Ife stayed close by without being intrusive. She adjusted Amara's blanket, brought her water, checked her pulse, then quietly moved the envelope to the side table as though she could lessen its weight by changing its position. "You don't have to read it tonight," Ife said softly. Amara looked at her and gave the faintest nod. But after a few minutes, she reached for the envelope anyway. Because Amara had never been the kind of woman who delayed reality. Before marriage, she had been sharp, observant, and remarkably composed under pressure. She had once worked inside strategy meetings where men twice her age underestimated her, only to discover too late that she had already seen the weakness in their proposal. That woman had not disappeared. She had only grown quieter. Now, with slow and careful movements, Amara opened the papers. The first pages were cold and procedural. Petitions, claims, asset references, proposed terms. She read every word. Then she found the attachment that made her pause, their marital agreement. A document signed years earlier, back when her father had insisted that clarity protects peace. At the time, her husband had smiled and agreed to everything, eager to look confident in front of Amara's family. He had skimmed more than he had studied. He signed fast, laughed lightly, and said that love made legal caution unnecessary. Amara remembered the moment clearly. And now, as she stared at clause after clause, she remembered something else. Her father had never done anything without thinking 10 steps ahead. Her breathing slowed, not because the pain disappeared, but because beneath the hurt, another feeling began to rise. Awareness. Not yet victory, not yet relief, just awareness. Something about this story was not going to end the way her husband imagined. At 6:40 the next morning, a black car pulled into the private entrance of the hospital. The man who stepped out did not carry flowers. He carried documents. His name was Bekizizwe Dlamini, senior legal executor for the Nwosu family holdings. He was a measured man in his 60s, the kind of man who spoke with great care because he understood the weight of every sentence. He entered Amara's suite after receiving quiet clearance from hospital administration. By then, the first sunlight had begun to soften the room. The triplets had been returned to her side. 3 bassinets, 3 sleeping faces, 3 new reasons to remain steady. Bekizizwe removed his glasses, greeted her respectfully, and sat beside her bed. "Mrs. Adekunle," he began, then gently corrected himself. "Amara Nwosu Adekunle." She already knew, before he said another word, that his visit was not ordinary. "Your father passed away last night," he said. The sentence did not crash into the room. It settled into it. Heavy. Definite. Amara closed her eyes. Her father had been ill but proud, private, controlled. He disliked dramatic goodbyes and sentimental displays. Even in weakness, he had remained deliberate. Still, knowing it was coming and hearing that it had happened were 2 different worlds. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she opened her eyes and asked the only question that mattered in that moment. Did he know the babies had arrived? Bekizizwe nodded. He was informed that your labor had begun. He asked to be updated through the night. That answer broke her heart and soothed it at the same time. He knew. He left this world knowing his grandchildren were here. Bekizizwe opened a leather folder and placed several documents on the bed. Your father's final directives were activated at 9:20 p.m. last night, he said. As his only child and designated successor, you have inherited controlling ownership of Nwosu Meridian Group, including Meridian Crown Bank, the private investment arm, and the family's majority international holdings. Amara stared at him. The words were clear, but their scale was almost too large to absorb. While sitting in a hospital gown, surrounded by newborn blankets and monitoring equipment, Bekizizwe continued gently. The current estimated valuation of the banking and holding structure stands above $11 billion. One of the babies made a soft sound in her sleep. Amara turned her head toward the bassinets, then back to the documents, then to the separation papers her husband had delivered only hours earlier. The contrast was almost impossible to describe. In a single night, she had been abandoned as a wife and entrusted as the head of an empire. But Bekizizwe was not finished. "There is more," he said. He slid forward a marked copy of the marital agreement. "Your father insisted on 3 protective provisions. 2 of them are now relevant." Amara's eyes narrowed slightly. He pointed to the first. A conduct clause. It allows for substantial reassessment of asset protection in the event of documented public humiliation, abandonment during a medically vulnerable period, or conduct that causes reputational or material harm to the Nwosu line. Then he pointed to the second. A family continuity clause. If a husband withdraws support or attempts dissolution within a protected postpartum period, financial penalties apply per child. Amara looked up. Bekizizwe met her gaze with professional calm. "You gave birth to 3 children." The meaning landed immediately. Her husband had walked into that hospital believing he was closing a chapter. In reality, he had activated consequences he never took seriously enough to understand. Amara leaned back against the pillows and let out a long, controlled breath. Not a triumphant one. Not yet. Just a breath from a woman realizing that timing had shifted. And for the first time since the envelope touched her bed, she allowed herself to think beyond the pain of the moment. Not toward revenge, toward order, toward protection, toward the children sleeping beside her. "Give me a few weeks," she said quietly. "I want to heal. I want my babies settled. After that, we move carefully." Bekizizwe nodded once. "That," he said, "is exactly what your father would have wanted." Amara disappeared from public view. Not dramatically, not bitterly, just completely. She moved with the babies to a secure family residence on the edge of the city, a walled estate surrounded by old trees, quiet stone paths, and wide rooms filled with light. There, for 6 weeks, she did 2 things. She became a mother. And she became impossible to underestimate. She learned the feeding patterns of 3 infants whose personalities were already beginning to show. One settled easily. One demanded to be held. One slept with one tiny fist tucked under the cheek as though already deep in thought. She named them Chidera, Zola, and Kofi. At the same time, every morning and every evening, she reviewed private briefings from Meridian Crown Bank, balance sheets, client exposure reports, strategic positions, pending renewals, executive structures, legacy holdings. Her father had not left chaos behind. He had left architecture. And as Amara studied what he built, she began to see not only the institution itself, but the philosophy beneath it. Patience, leverage, timing, silence before movement. Some nights she read with a sleeping baby on her chest. Some mornings she reviewed credit reports while bottles warmed nearby. Some afternoons, she held conference calls so quietly that anyone listening from the other side might never guess she was standing beside 3 bassinets in a nursery filled with sunlight. And then, one evening, while reviewing high-value commercial clients, she saw a familiar name. Adekunle Dynamics Holdings, her husband's company. She sat very still. The company's primary growth facility, its debt restructuring window, its next capital review. All of it ran through Meridian Crown. Her fingers rested on the edge of the document. There was no anger in her face at that moment, only clarity. The same man who had walked away from her during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life had built his confidence on foundations he never truly examined. He had enjoyed the appearance of independence, but the machinery under his success had always belonged to rooms he was not invited to fully understand. And now those rooms belonged to Amara. She looked at little Kofi sleeping in the crook of her arm and whispered, almost to herself, "Your father is going to ask for grace from a woman he thought he had already dismissed." Then she closed the file. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew premature action weakens strong strategy. Meanwhile, outside the world Amara had entered, her husband was still performing certainty. His name was Tade Adekunle, and he wore confidence the way some men wear fragrance, too much, and mostly for other people. Within days of leaving the hospital, photographs began appearing online. Private dinners, rooftop lights, polished captions about new beginnings, clarity, peace, and choosing the future. To strangers, he looked composed, modern, untouched. But images rarely tell the full story. They did not show the investors he had delayed calling back. They did not show the missed projections, the overstretched operating burn, or the advisors who had quietly started distancing themselves from him. They did not show that his company's survival depended less on brilliance than on extension. More time, more credit, more belief from people with deeper pockets. He needed a renewal from Meridian Crown Bank more than he wanted to admit. He told himself it would be routine. After all, hadn't he already done what was necessary in his personal life? Hadn't he removed complication? Hadn't he streamlined the future? That was the strange thing about arrogance. It often mistakes recklessness for discipline. By the time the official letter arrived from Meridian Crown Bank, inviting him to a high-level review meeting, Tade smiled. A chief-level meeting, finally. The kind of access he had been chasing for years. He took it as validation. He took it as proof that his momentum was intact. He did not ask why the invitation came now. And that would become one of the costliest oversights of his life. If you're still here, type "quiet strength" in the comments. I always love hearing from people who understand that the calmest person in the room is not always the weakest. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning on the top executive floor of Meridian Crown headquarters. Tade arrived early. He wore his best charcoal suit, carried a refined presentation deck, and entered with the careful confidence of a man determined to look unshaken. The boardroom was long, elegant, and spare. Glass walls reflected the city skyline. The wood table was dark and immaculate. Water glasses stood in perfect symmetry. 2 legal advisors were already seated. An executive secretary reviewed a folder near the far end. At the head of the table, one chair faced the window. Occupied. Turned away. Tade placed his presentation materials down, adjusted his tie, and cleared his throat. "Good morning," he said, offering his practiced corporate smile. "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the next phase of growth and expansion." Then the chair turned, and time changed shape. Amara sat before him. Not in silk, not in softness, not in the fragile stillness of a hospital bed. She wore a structured deep green suit, understated gold earrings, and the expression of a woman who no longer needed anyone to explain who she was. In her arms, sleeping peacefully beneath a cream blanket, was baby Zola. For one full second, Tade forgot how to speak. His hand remained on the back of the chair he had intended to pull out. His presentation folder slipped sideways against the polished wood. Amara looked at him with composed stillness, not cold, not theatrical, just fully awake to the truth of the moment. "Good morning, Tade," she said. "Please have a seat." He sat, not because he wanted to, because shock has a way of making movement obedient. One of the legal advisors opened a file. "We'll begin," he said, "by reviewing matters connected to your current commercial exposure and several personal contractual obligations now under active enforcement." Tade looked from the lawyer to Amara and back again. The room, though quiet, suddenly felt very small. The first advisor spoke with formal precision. "Your company's credit position with Meridian Crown is under structured review. However, before any renewal discussion can proceed, there are domestic contractual matters requiring resolution under the Nuosu family protections attached to your marital agreement." The second advisor slid documents across the table. "Specifically, your attempted dissolution filing, your conduct during the protected postpartum period, and your documented abandonment of your spouse during active medical recovery." Tade's jaw tightened. Amara said nothing. The first advisor continued. "The agreement you signed contains clear remedies. Several have now been triggered." He outlined them one by one. Penalty assessments, asset protection reversals, restricted access claims, emergency family support obligations, reputational injury provisions tied to public conduct. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was shouted. That was what made it heavier. Order can sound far more powerful than anger. Then came the final point. "Because 3 children were born within the protected family clause period," said the second advisor, "support and transfer obligations are multiplied accordingly." Tade looked at Amara as if he were hoping she might interrupt the process. She did not. Instead, she folded her hands and asked only one question. "Did you read the agreement before you signed it?" It was such a simple question, but in it lived years of assumption, years of pride, years of believing that rooms built by old power were decorative rather than decisive. Tade looked away first. "This is excessive," he said. "You're making this personal." For the first time, Amara leaned forward. "No," she said calmly. "Personal was the hospital. This is administrative." No one in the room moved. The sentence settled like stone. And with that, something in Tade's expression began to change. Not yet regret. Not yet humility. But the first clear fracture in certainty. The days that followed were not loud. No public scandal exploded. No interviews surfaced. No dramatic speeches were given. That, too, was part of what made Amara's response so effective. She did not chase spectacle. She pursued structure. Her legal team moved through every issue carefully. Her banking advisors separated business risk from personal conduct. Family offices that once overlooked her now addressed her directly. Senior board members who had served under her father watched closely, then gradually began to understand that the daughter they thought they needed to guide had already mastered the language of power. Tade, on the other hand, found that charm weakens quickly when leverage disappears.
People who once praised his vision began asking firmer questions. Partners who once called him brilliant began requesting documentation. The woman who had stood behind him in the hospital, elegant, composed, and convenient, started taking longer to return his calls. Because some people are attracted to power,
but not to its collapse. When she finally did respond, it was not with comfort. It was with caution. She had her own financial interests to protect, her own position to preserve. And once it became clear that Amara now sat over the institution, entangled with Tade's future, distance arrived quickly. That realization hurt him more than he expected, not because he loved deeply, but because he had assumed loyalty would follow status. He was learning otherwise. 6 weeks after the boardroom meeting, the final settlement conference took place. This time, Tade entered without performance. He looked tired. Not ruined beyond repair, just stripped of illusion. His lawyer sat beside him. 2 representatives from Meridian Crown's commercial division joined remotely. Amara arrived last, precisely on time, carrying no visible emotion and no need to display authority. By then, the room already understood where it sat. The proposed resolution was difficult, but not merciless. That surprised Tade. A portion of his company would be absorbed under structured oversight. His most unstable obligations would be reorganized. Certain personal luxury assets would be surrendered. Family support provisions would be formalized and front-loaded. And in exchange, he would avoid the far more destructive outcomes that reckless escalation might have caused. He reviewed the pages slowly. Then he looked up. "You could have destroyed everything," he said. Amara held his gaze. "I could have," she answered. "But my children deserve a future larger than bitterness." That was the moment he finally understood what separated them. He had acted from impulse. She had responded from responsibility. He mistook her gentleness for weakness because he never recognized that disciplined people do not reveal their full strength every day. Some reserve it for the moment it is required. Tade lowered his eyes to the agreement. Then, with a hand far less steady than the one that had delivered papers in a hospital room, he signed. Months passed. The story did not end with applause. It matured into something better. Amara formally assumed expanded leadership within Meridian Crown Group. Her role was not ceremonial. She worked. She restructured internal mentorship tracks. She opened a maternal financial recovery initiative for women abandoned during crisis. She launched a private legal resource network for young mothers facing coercive separation and economic manipulation. She named the initiative the Dawn Circle. Not after herself, not after her father, but after the belief that no matter how dark a night becomes, morning still arrives. The triplets grew. Chidera became the observant one, always looking as if he were studying people. Zola laughed first and loudest. Kofi had a thoughtful stillness that reminded the older family staff of Amara's father. Their nursery became a place of sunlight, books, soft music, and the quiet kind of abundance that does not need display. And slowly, the woman who had once been introduced in rooms merely as someone's wife became something no one could reduce again. Not because wealth changed her, because responsibility revealed her. One afternoon, while standing in the executive wing outside her office, Amara paused by the windows overlooking the city. She remembered the hospital, the envelope on the bed, the ache in her chest, the sound of newborn breathing, the unbearable silence after betrayal. And then she thought of everything that followed. The documents, the inheritance, the learning, the boardroom, the signatures, the children, the work, the rebuilding. She realized that the most powerful part of her story was not that she had been wronged. It was that she had not allowed that moment to define the rest of her life. She turned as Ife, the same nurse from the hospital, now invited to a family celebration for the children's first birthday, walked toward her, holding little Zola on her hip. "You look peaceful," Ife said with a smile. Amara smiled back. "Not peaceful," she said. "Grounded." And maybe that was even better. Because peace can be temporary. Grounded people endure. That evening, under warm lights in the garden of the family estate, the triplets celebrated their first birthday surrounded by music, cousins, laughter, and the kind of love that does not leave when things become inconvenient. Amara stood at the center of it all, not as a woman who had won against someone, but as a woman who had chosen what to build after being deeply disappointed. And that is a very different kind of victory. So if you ever find yourself in a moment where someone mistakes your silence for powerlessness, remember Amara. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying an entire future no one else can see. Sometimes the hand that rocks the cradle also signs the decisions that shape industries. And sometimes the person others walk away from is the very person history is preparing to raise. What would you have done in her place? Would you have chosen harsh revenge or steady justice? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience, wisdom, and comeback. Because some endings are not about getting even. They are about rising so fully that the past can no longer reach you.